Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is March 20th, 2022, and I'm your host, James Myers. It is a pleasure to be joined in dialogue by members of the Toronto Philosophy and Calgary Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. To speak, I would ask participants to use the raise hands feature in Zoom, and I will call on you in order using your first name. As always, I have suggested 3 themes to focus our discussion, which are posted on the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. As we exchange thoughts on today's reading, I'll briefly summarize and try to connect different perspectives to a common thread of ideas. We can go in any direction the group chooses, but for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. After we finish recording in 2 hours, I welcome anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. Today we continue reading The Sophist from 235e to 254b in the ongoing dialogue between young Theaetetus and the unnamed visitor from Elea. The visitor from Elea is emphatic that the expression "that which is not," which is favored by people who profit from knowledge they claim to possess, is illogical. In Plato's time, those people were called sophists, and although we no longer use that name, we still find such people all around us, and they wield great power. They can be very convincing in telling us what things such as virtue are not, but when challenged to explain what they are, they often become entangled in logical contradictions. In today's reading, we encounter the visitor's quotes of Parmenides, also from Elea, who is held in great esteem. The visitor explains Parmenides' theory of the nature of being using the term "that which is," insisting it has no logical opposite of "is not," and is neither at rest nor subject to change. The visitor asserts that a clear account of "that which is" requires expertise. In our last episode, we debated Plato's method of collection and division, in which expertise is divided into successive opposites to follow the common thread and, quote, chase a thing through both the particular and the general, unquote. To appreciate this method of dialectic, which was met with some skepticism, we will need to revisit the proposition made by Socrates in the Phaedo that everything in the universe comes to be in opposites. Opposites are pairs of 2, and if we accept that the limits of everything come to be in paired opposites, then perhaps we can expect that continuous division of 2 will eventually and inevitably lead to the first principle, which is the aim of dialectic. We will also have cause to revisit the Timaeus, with which we began season 1 of Plato's Pod, and to reflect further on the nature of the soul presented throughout Plato's dialogues. These provide the foundation to understand Plato's presentation of the state of being as separate from the state of coming to be at 248a of the Sophist. Being is its own derivative, infinitely dense, capable of neither increase nor decrease. It just always is, in both the past and the future. Coming to be is what we call the present, which is a state of constant change, motion, and increase and decrease of all physical things. Our bodies and our 5 senses exist in that continuously changing state of coming to be, but our souls exist in the separate realm, the eternal, changeless state of being. The realm of being is not accessible to the bodily senses, only to the mind's reasoning. This is emphasized at 254b in the Sophist. So with this background from Phaedo and Timaeus and other dialogues, we can perhaps better understand the visitor's description of the forms. The forms he implies measures the capacity of the things that exist, and he proposes that the capacity, or potential, defines anything that shares in being. He goes on to explain the composition of the whole of being, having the characteristic of oneness in its composite parts. He and Theaetetus end by concluding that some forms can mix with others, some can exclude others, some are common to all, and some always cause division. As they associate with one another with these differences, the forms necessarily exist in a harmony, and knowledge of their harmonics is held to be essential. We might imagine that such knowledge would require first and foremost an appreciation of number and calculation, which Socrates set out in the Republic as requisite for any philosopher. In any respect, harmony is a measure of proportionality, which, in the visitor's view, is a property of the soul that we discussed at the end of our last episode. So I found the explanation of the forms in the Sophist to be particularly enlightening, and I wonder if you will too. It led me to begin rereading the dialogue Parmenides, with which we will end this season. And I now see that dialogue in a new and far clearer light. That dialogue features a discussion of one in contrast to many, and touches on the nature of being in time, which we will encounter today. So I'll propose here for anyone who would consider the idea that the forms are the means by which our minds, in the eternal realm of being, apprehend the logical order of change in the physical state of coming to be that our bodies occupy. The forms are geometric and necessarily do not exist in or affect the physical universe in order that they can accurately describe the physics. Einstein clearly proved the physical universe to be geometric, otherwise E would not equal mc squared. And Heisenberg's uncertainty principle established that our knowledge of physics will always require estimation. As one support for my proposition, I offer 248d to E in today's reading, which is a discussion of the separation of the observer and the observed, as we can now witness in quantum mechanics. For another, I refer to Parmenides' geometry of the whole being and the one at 244e. So we have some complex details to sort through today, so please bear with me if I move us from one thread to the next without reaching a full conclusion on a matter. We can return to these matters in any event in 2 weeks in our conclusion of the Sophist. So now, before we revisit the contention that everything comes to be in opposites, let's start with a few minutes for some modern context on the reasons to understand that which is and the nature of being. Why is it such an important understanding today, 2,400 years after Plato wrote about it? Or is it now mere semantics and of no material relevance? Either way, can anyone provide examples to support or refute the present importance of a discussion on the meaning of that which is? And so I'll put that question out there and just wondering what people think about that. Is there some particular importance of that which is, understanding that which is now? Is it more important or less important than it was in Plato's time? What are the circumstances that we find ourselves in now to understand the actual nature of being? I'll maybe just throw out one idea, which is something that I read a couple of days ago with respect to this tragic and horrible war in the Ukraine. And it's that someone posted what's called a deep fake video of Ukraine's president. And in this deepfake video, which was not a real event, it was computer generated. Apparently, the president of the Ukraine was saying that his soldiers should surrender, put down their weapons, and so this was a faked video. Now, fortunately, it was quite clear that it was faked. You know, the audio was poor and the imaging was poor, but you know, as computers get more and more powerful, these things will become more and more convincing. And I think there's, lots of evidence. We receive emails from fake senders. Computer algorithms are getting faster and faster. Sometimes it's hard to discern reality from things that are not real. In other words, that which is from, that which is false. So that was just one example, I think, of quite a modern relevance of this particular question, what that is, what that means. And I'm just wondering if there's any other thoughts, JK?
You mentioned quantum mechanics, right? Relating to this issue of is and is not, right? And so we don't really understand. We have different interpretations of what is there in the quantum realm. Sense of wholeness, or whether there is something there or not. So I think there's like 8 or 9 or 10 different interpretations. So we're still uncertain whether what is, it just is, or is just one being, as Parmenides asserts, or whether it's just there are many worlds, as another interpretation is, and that so that uncertainty is certainly convincing us that we don't know. We're not sure what if it's if as Parmenides says, there's one being, or if there's many, and it is so.
And that's a good point. From my introduction, I mentioned 248 DDE, which in the Sophist, I think is actually a reference to the observer effect. The observer effect in quantum mechanics is that, when we see a beam of light coming through two slits, the act of observation changes its scattering pattern compared to if we didn't observe it. And there's different interpretations of quantum mechanics. There's a Copenhagen interpretation, there's Bohmian mechanics, and we just really don't know what is real and what isn't real in terms of that very minute level of the universe. So it's a good example. Thank you. Darren?
So this problem of being could sound like such an abstract question, but I really like the way you brought it down to earth about the referring to the deep fake of the Ukrainian president. So I think, so when I was thinking of that, it made me think about how the problem of being and its relevance could just be the problem of knowledge, basically. And actually, in fact, as we know that this dialogue is sort of a second part of a trilogy, and the first dialogue was the Theaetetus, which was on the very problem of knowledge. So there's a sort of a thread here. So I generally think of the problem of being when people ask that question as being something very abstract and metaphysical, but I really like the way James sort of brought it down to earth to make it sound more like, or it could be like a problem of knowledge, like what actually is. So I think that's one part of the question. I think the really abstract question where you just simply ask, what is being, that could exist too. But yeah, I like seeing this connection now, that it could just be seen as also a problem of knowledge. And that's, of course, more difficult and significant than ever, given what we know, like false knowledge can lead to. This is the era of the internet where there's so much so-called information out there. And we know it's not just innocent, right? We know that, I think when the internet first arose, I think there's a lot of optimism about it, and there was a lot of maybe naivete about it. But now we see its dangers in all sorts of ways. So yes, so yeah, maybe it could just be seen as a problem of knowledge.
Good point. I like the way you mentioned the dialogue Theaetetus, because of course Theaetetus is the main character in this particular dialogue that we're looking at. And in the dialogue Theaetetus, the whole question, they were debating whether Protagoras' statement that man is the measure of all things is true or not. And the point that Protagoras was saying is that man is the sole determinant of that which is and that which is not. And that was the whole point of the dialogue Theaetetus. And so, as you said, it's perhaps a question of knowledge. And certainly, when I think it was probably about 5 years ago, a White House spokesperson claimed that there were alternative facts. How can a fact be alternative? This is this confusion that arises, and I think there's a lot of discord that arises among people as a result. So thank you for that. And we'll go to Evan, then JK.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to considering or seeking for what reality is. I want to have the power to give my own self, the human, to believe what they want to be real in a way. So instead of getting the agenda of the reality from outside factors, exterior factors, I want to find a way to make it real for myself and what I want to believe. I wish there was a video of my dreams, and I wish that was real. And yeah, I think I'm seeking for that way that I have a say in what I want to be the reality. You have answers. I'm listening.
It's a good point. Certainly, we have human creativity, and that's, we can create we can create things that become real that weren't real before. And I think that's a very important point, that, it's not just, reality isn't just fixed forever. it's something that is fluid, I think, and that's a very good point. In fact, I was reading a really interesting article about it was in New Scientist about a theory that space-time actually is created by observation. So every time we make an observation, this theory says that space-time actually expands in that particular direction that we're making the observation. So it's not like space-time isn't a static fabric. It's something that actually responds to our creative impulses. So I think it's a really interesting idea. So thank you. JK?
Yeah, so this really talking about what the question of knowledge, right, in the present day, it's referring back to the text, right, where the Sophists are playing a crucial role in raising this question of knowledge, right? Because it was that time it was maybe taken for granted that Parmenides, theory of theory was correct, that there is only one. That's the one being is the truth. And so the Sophists are, perhaps as much as Socrates is raising the question of whether, that is true or not. And that, bringing in to the, to the discussion, the notion of becoming, right. And the idea of the dialectic and the theory of, opposites and so forth.
It's a good point. And, there is that distinction, as I mentioned in the introduction, between being and becoming, certainly in Plato's context, that the realm of being is eternal, changeless. It exists in the past and in the future. The present is the state of becoming, in which everything is coming to be, but never actually is. And that relates to Timaeus 28a, which is one of my favorite sections of Timaeus, in which Plato makes that distinction between that which always is and never becomes, and that which only becomes but never is. And so our bodies and all things physical are in the realm of coming to be, which always becomes but never is, whereas our minds are in the eternal, changeless realm of being. So I think it's a very important thing to understand what Plato's talking about here, to understand that distinction between that eternal realm of being and the constantly changing state of becoming. Maybe we'll just turn from here to I'll just share my screen here, to the question that we encountered last time, this question of division and collection that was raised in the first part of the Sophist, where it was said that expertise, you could divide expertise and continuously divide it into two opposites to come out to a final conclusion. And I think there was some doubt among the group about that. And I just wanted to bring us back to that a little bit so that we can move forward with this understanding, maybe whether things actually come to be in opposites. And so I'll just refer to Phaedo 70D to E, which is on the screen if everybody can see this. It's just this short paragraph here. I'll just read it. For all things which come to be, let us see whether they come to be in this way, that is, from their opposites, if they have such, as the beautiful is the opposite of the ugly, and the just of the unjust, and 1,000 other things of the kind. Let us examine whether those that have an opposite must necessarily come to be from their opposite and from nowhere else. As, for example, when something comes to be larger, it must necessarily become larger from having been smaller before. So that's the assertion that Socrates made in the Phaedo. And I just wanted to return to that. I think when we discussed the Phaedo, back a month or so ago, maybe there wasn't a general consensus on this matter, but I just wanted to return to this because I think this theme is coming up here in the Sophist, and I think it's very important to understanding how Plato is presenting the forms. And so I'm just wondering what people think about this. Can you think of anything that does not come to be in opposites? We've seen examples of, for example, temperature. Temperature comes to be in hot or cold. So those would be opposites. Or height. Height comes to be in tall and short. We see the opposites of good and bad. You can't have good without having bad, and you can't have bad without having good. We've seen Socrates talk about the opposites of life and death. In the first part of the Sophist, they made the distinction of animals between tame animals and wild animals. And now in this section of the Sophist, there's the distinction that's made between change and rest as opposites. And so, just wondering if anybody can think of anything that does not come to be in opposites, or anyone who wants to challenge the proposition that things come to be in opposites. Are there any particular thoughts on that?
With the ultimate or the original momentum or force or energy, that would that be something that doesn't come in opposites? I mean, energy transforms into matter, but what is the the original life force, right? Supposedly, right?
Yeah, I mean, that would be, I think, the question. What was the very first thing that came to be? And first would imply that there would be no opposites, because opposites require two, right? So maybe that's where we're talking about the singularity. The idea that in physics, a singularity is a black hole, for example, and it doesn't have the opposites that the fabric of space-time has. So that's an unresolved question. But I would think logically, the first thing that came to be wouldn't have opposites, because it would be two at that point. It'd just be one. And certainly Plato talks about the number two, which we saw in the Phaedo. There was that great little distinction that he made about, how does two come to be? So it's a good question. Darren, your thoughts?
I wonder for something like the singularity, though. I mean, I don't know what Plato would thought of would have thought of this idea, but or the idea. But I wonder if we consider it or something like that as not having an opposite. I wonder if Plato would wonder what we could actually say about it or think about it, or if it's just something that's unsayable. Because something that was sort of an interesting thread in this dialogue is that there's a lot of talk about, I mean, I guess this happens in a lot of dialogues, not just this one, but there's a lot of talk of like being able to say something or not say something and how hard it is to be able to utter something. Like at a certain point, I'll have to look for it, but at a certain point he says like what we're trying to look for is like unsayable, and unthinkable and unconceivable. There's like a list of terms he uses. So maybe there's a sort of point about what is sayable, and there's sort of oppositions that way, just maybe, I don't know, by nature of our language or thinking. And then if it's just like one thing, and there's no opposites, maybe there's no parts either. Maybe it's something that's like maybe that's not even like thinkable or conceivable, or there's no point for us in thinking about it. I don't know. There's just a thought about the singularity or whatever.
Yeah.
Or the unmoved mover, right? Or something like that.
Right. It's a good point, and I think Darren, you raised it. I've got that quote actually on the in the handout here, so we'll come across that. But I think maybe what you raised is the idea that being is a singularity, because certainly in this part that we're talking about today, they say that you can't say not being. So being might be the singularity, and there is nothing beyond being. Eva, your thoughts?
I'm wondering if we can even understand the concept of thinking without opposites, because when you even say being, I can't stop thinking about not being. Or when I think of like black holes, like, but there's something again. So I don't know, is that even understandable?
It's a good question. I mean, I the more I think about opposites, the more I that's the way I seem to think. Like you're always comparing something. And that's why I was asking the group, like, can anybody think of something that does not come to be in opposites? JK, your thoughts?
So maybe you can't. Yeah, it's just like I think it's not just being, but if you think of being, it's automatically have to bring in non-being, right? So it is something that is not sayable, right? Like in some of the great philosophies like Taoism, once you say it, that's not what it is, or so it is it is because if you think of order, right, the opposite would be chaos. So you'd have to include chaos in the idea of order.
Or disorder, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Disorder and order, yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh, good point. Darren?
So I don't know if this is anticipating where you might want to get to later. So we can save it for later if you want. But this discussion is making me think of a bit of the excursion they have on the sophist versus the philosopher, which is really interesting. I mean, there's like finally they say something that seems to be positive about the distinction. They just sort of the visitor does. So this is at sorry, I'm trying to find the part 249D, just right there. The visitor has this paragraph. I just want to read it out. I think it's so interesting. Because there's so many questions and back and forth in these dialogues. And then it's always interesting when, it seems like maybe Plato's trying to sneak in a view here or something. But of course, this is going to be up for interpretation. But so the visitor here says, the philosopher, the person who values these things the most. So I think they're talking about like knowledge, understanding, intelligence, just in the above. The person who values these things the most absolutely has to refuse to accept the claim that everything is at rest, either from defenders of the one or from friends of the many forms. In addition, he has to refuse to listen to people who make that which is change in every way. He has to be like a child begging for both and say that which is everything is both the unchanging and that which changes. So I find it so interesting. I don't know if I've encountered this reading Plato before. So, and this, if this is supposed to be a late text, maybe this is Plato like finally coming settle on a certain view. As we saw, like earlier in this piece, in this dialogue, he also talks about the endless disputes, right, between the people who think like everything is change and everything is one. And where there are many forms, there's one, and then he goes on and on. Like there's all these distinctions he draws, and he calls it like this endless disputation. And here he's saying, it seems like he might be just saying, I mean, it's in the words of the visitor, but it seems like he's proposing that the philosopher isn't just interested in one side of the opposites, and saying that everything is this, everything is one, like, or everything is change. Like he just thinks, like it seems like Plato may be coming around to the view that that's just so pointless. It's like the philosopher is interested in the whole, and there are these different forms. There is change, and there is something that's changeless, and there are things that are singular, and there are things that are not, and of course, we could be interested in any one of those things, but he seems, at least some of the dialogue, again, this is maybe someone else will interpret it differently, but like some of the earlier parts of the dialogue of the reading today, it seems like he's almost impatient with these groups. It's like, oh, there's this group, and then, oh, they say everything is one, and then there's this other group that says everything is, and he's like, okay, well, here he seems to come right out and say, well, the philosopher is interested in the whole, in all of it. We want to know, if you want to have knowledge, you need to know, like I think James read the quote earlier about, there are like things that combine, like how things get put together and what things go with which. Like there's that part where he talks about that. And so there becomes a more sort of subtlety in like where Plato wants to go, where there's all these different elements in the world, and we have to understand. And they don't just, you can't just say they like there's like a complexity and specificity to how these parts go together and work. And it's not just like everything is one or everything is changed. Like there's different things combined different ways. And that the philosopher's interest and goal is just to understand how like the world fits together in this way, how all this fits together. So that's just, I mean, I don't know, this might be jumping ahead a bit in the discussion about what the philosopher does versus the sophist, but I just thought like what the discussion just just raised this interesting thing where a passage here where the philosopher seems to be interested in all of it.
It's actually a very good point. And you know, actually the part that I wanted to end with today follows shortly after that section. So the part I wanted to end today goes from 252B to 253C. And it's actually talking about what you raised, this idea of the whole and the parts and how that fits together in the context of the forms. And this is what I found the most powerful thing I have read about the forms so far. And it was about the sixth time after I read it that I finally realized, and that's why I said in the introduction that I thought this was essential to understanding what is said in the dialogue Parmenides. Because, you know, I think as you pointed out, the philosopher is interested in that whole and how everything fits together. You know, the philosopher is the person who tries to bring that together. And I think it's the idea of harmonics that that the visitor raises near the end of today's reading. That is how the philosopher brings it together. And the way you would bring together something with harmonics is through number and calculation, which is what Socrates said in the Republic was essential knowledge for the philosopher, which we don't see as essential knowledge for the philosopher now, but it was 2,400 years ago. And I think that's very important to understand. And that's how you bring all of these disparate things together and find that common thread that ties everything together. I think that's very important. So thank you for raising that. We'll go to Jose.
Yeah, I was trying to find a visual representation of being. And I started thinking about what we all learned in elementary school, the Venn diagrams. Remember that representation, you have a rectangle and you have two circles in it. And the two circles either intersect or don't. So if those two circles don't intersect, they are opposites of each other. Because if there's an intersection, that means that there's something that is true for both, right? So if you want to represent just or unjust, that's the way you do it. Two separate circles that do not intersect. Now, think about it. So what's outside those two circles? What's outside those two circles is an infinite number of pairs, right, that you just decided not to represent on those two circles. Okay, that's good. So what's the rectangle? So I thought about it, and I think maybe the rectangle is the being, is the holder, is the thing that never changes. There are only the pairs inside it that move around and no longer are opposites or etc. So I envision it as a platform. The being is the platform, is the stuff that never changes because it's holding. All the individual pairs are moved from one opposite to the other. Anyway, I mean, sometimes we cannot, you cannot represent in words. Maybe you can represent in a picture.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jose. I think that's actually what I've tried to do here on the screen is a pictorial representation of being. And I just wanted to, because you mentioned circles, so there's this very key part of Timaeus here in which they talk about the universe as the living thing, capital L, capital T. And it says, now that it was the living thing's nature to be eternal, but it wasn't possible to bestow eternity fully upon anything that is begotten. So the physical universe is begotten, but eternity exists before and after the physical universe. And so the craftsman, began to think of making a moving image of eternity. At the same time as he brought order to the universe, he would make an eternal image, moving according to number, of eternity remaining in unity. So that's the whole that Darren brought about, I think, is that idea of the eternity remaining in unity. This number, of course, is what we now call time, which is Plato's little sneaky way of saying, of course, of course. Do we really think that that's number is what we call time? But anyway, it's something I think he's trying to tell us there. And he goes on to say, and the theme of circles keeps coming up throughout Plato. So near the bottom here that I'm highlighting, these rather are forms of time that have come to be. Time that imitates eternity and circles according to number. And then we see the idea of circles again in this dialogue when, or in the part that we're reading today, when the visitor refers to Parmenides' quote of spheres. And we'll get to that quote because I think that's an important one. So a sphere is a three-dimensional circle, essentially. So I've put these diagrams here that I wanted to consider, and just I'm suggesting that we imagine that we put a circle around these three diagrams. So the diagrams are a straight line, and I've just labeled the 2 points, the two ends of the straight line, A and B. And then I've got two straight lines intersecting each other, forming a cross. So the horizontal line is AB, and the vertical line is CD. And then what I've done in the third diagram, I've got that cross, and I created two triangles. I've joined C and B, so I've joined the top of the vertical line with the right-hand side of the horizontal line. And I've drawn a triangle from the bottom of the vertical line to the left of the horizontal line. And if we put a circle around each of these diagrams, imagine what would happen if you started to rotate these diagrams inside the circle. So the first one would be just a single rotation. There'd be no change. That first line, it's just one single line. There's no opposition. It would just continue rotating inside the circle. The second one, which is the cross, the two lines, the vertical line and the horizontal line inside a circle, they could rotate independently, right? So one line could rotate in one way, the other could rotate in the other way. They could rotate, they can impose each other, like impose one on the other. So that's kind of, I think, independent rotation. So either can rotate, and there's no pairing in this particular one of this cross. No, where the pairing happens, I think, is in the third diagram, which is where we've got the two triangles. And so if you rotate that third one with the two triangles inside a circle, I think that's where you would get that dependency, and that's where would be the opposites, I think. Like, I think that, you could put, if we're talking about temperature, one of those triangles could be hot, the other could be cold. And, why do I say circle? Well, circle is that which has no beginning and no end. So I think that's maybe why we could maybe think of those as a way of like visualizing being and this idea of opposites. I just wanted to present that idea. Just think about those three things inside a circle. So we can talk about that further, but Moshe, your thoughts?
Good morning.
Hi.
Okay, I want to go back to, I want to address several things. I want to go back to, I believe it was Darren who was talking about, that the philosopher is interested in everything. And I want to just take a shot at everything for a second. I believe it is helpful to understand what Plato is saying in Plato's terms, not in our terms, by taking a look briefly at the pre-Socratics. When Thales, Miletus came up and said that everything is water, okay? He was talking about nature. That is the everything that the materialists are talking about. And remember that from Thales through Anaxagoras, who was the teacher of Socrates, that nature was conceived as everything, and being, what being was, the question of being was, what is the nature of being? Now, in the could you go to the that quote that you had from the Timaeus?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Now, it was the living thing's nature to be eternal. It isn't possible to bestow eternity fully upon anything that is begotten. So one of the ways of interpreting this with a slight, with a nod to the pre-Socratics, is that the living thing, which is being, okay, it must be eternal, and it is not possible to bestow being upon anything that is begotten. So being is not begotten. Being is eternal. It comes from nothing. And the question is, well, what is being? What is the nature of being? What is the nature of nature? And Parmenides he obviously broke from the materialists, and we have other people who've broken from the materialists too, like Lucretius and Democritus a little bit later. But what he is saying is that being, making a logical point of view, if being is everything, then there is no other. There is no non-being, okay? And if being is what you can talk about, because we talk about all the things that are around us, but the philosophers are really interested in a much grander idea of being, then it makes no sense to talk about what isn't, because it isn't, okay? You can't even get a conception of it. So that's why Parmenides' being was, it was full, it was eternal. He uses the idea of spheres, sort of to give us a mental image. And then remember, Parmenides also goes, when he's talking to the goddess, he always, he has two parts of what he's saying. Part of it is the logical part. The other part, he goes into a poem and he's talking about becoming and things like that. So for me, it is helpful to try to interpret Plato in his own terms by talking about being as everything that there is. And Plato's turn, Plato, gives another logical turn to Parmenides and says, well, the things that are really being are these forms, these things that we can know directly by the mind, which makes him a realist. But these forms have these eternal parts because they all participate in being. But it raises an interesting question, which the later part of the Sophist deals with, because he starts talking about being and the other in order to try to make sense out of non-being. And so if being has an other, he's trying to say that it would be not being, and therefore you can talk about not being in terms of the other. And I'm not quite sure. To me, that might be so much semantic hand waving, but I think that's how he's trying to get at it. And he's not talking about particular tables and chairs. He's talking about nature. He's talking about everything when he's talking about being.
You raise some good context there in terms of the pre-Socratics and that world in which Plato operated and worked. And I think what you said about non-being, I think is something that features very importantly in this first part of today's reading, which we'll get to in a few minutes maybe. And Parmenides' view that the being is everything, that there is nothing beyond being. The only non-being is nothing. I think is that's the conclusion I'm drawing. But in the proposition I made in my introduction, I see the forms as existing in that realm of being, which is not a physical realm. So the forms are not physical. In my proposition, that the forms exist in that realm, which is only accessible by the mind, but that's the eternal realm. And that which is begotten, as they say in Timaeus, is the physical realm in which our bodies and our bodily senses operate. But the mind doesn't operate in that physical realm. The mind is elsewhere. It's in that realm of the eternal being. And I think that's key to understanding what Plato is going on about here. So thank you. And Joel?
Just looking for a quick clarification, just making sure a large part of this doesn't go right over my head. Still digesting and having fun playing with the question or the challenge you said towards the beginning of all of this. And just so that I get it right, can you repeat it again in your own words? Like, what was it again? Like, can you imagine something that's never becoming or doesn't have opposites?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, can you imagine anything that comes to be without opposites? Is what I was asking.
Now, I thought I saw what you were getting at. Did you give your answer before the last question, or were you using the circle as basically that's an example of what doesn't have opposites, essentially? Or am I not seeing that properly?
I don't think I made that statement, but I would say that that could be the case, actually, that the circle doesn't have opposites in the sense that it doesn't have a beginning or an end. And opposites would tend to have a beginning and end, right? So, in this diagram that I put of the two triangles, there is a beginning and an end to each of the triangles, but they are connected. And this connection here, where it's, at the midpoint of those two triangles, I've labeled E. I think that's what he's talking about in that section about harmonics, and that idea that that which is actually the neither of the opposites. That which is actually is the conjunction of those opposites. So it's a third thing, and that's a point that is made in this dialogue around 248 or 247. This idea that which is this midpoint, and it's neither of those other two. So it's a third thing. That which is a third thing, is what he's saying.
Okay, I think I'm with you. Thank you very much.
All right. Jose.
Yeah, this is more a question, I think. In the theory of forms of Plato, is it only about material things? Are the forms only representation of material things? Or it includes immaterial as well? And the reason why I raised the question is, if it's material, like what we can sense or perceive with our senses, then there are no opposites. Like, for instance, the form of a horse, the form of a house, the form of whatever. What's the opposite of a chicken? Right? But if it's immaterial, then you can argue you have to have opposites, because just and unjust, moral and immoral, all these opposites are adjectives of a noun. So then the question is, this is my question, what is your interpretation of the forms? Do they include immaterial things? And if they do, then that means that's where you spin off from that platform all the infinite pairs. Question.
Well, I would ask others to answer as well, but my view is that the forms are both immaterial and material. He says that there's a form of the good, for example. The good is that which gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower. That's the form of the good. So the good is immaterial. There's a form of beauty. There's a form of the one. So those are immaterial examples of forms. And they all have opposites. And now, so you asked about the form of a chicken or a horse. Those would be examples of living things. And the opposite of living things is non-living things. And I think we saw that example actually in the first part of the Sophist. So that's how I think you have to kind of go to the general category. So it's not necessarily that there's an opposite to a chicken per se, but a chicken is a living thing. And so that's the general category. That's the way I would see it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but anybody else who wants to tackle that one is welcome.
So there's a form of the beautiful and a form of the ugly.
Right.
Just to follow on Plato's thought.
Right.
So that's what I was saying. If that rectangle I was referring to in my previous example is the forms, then whenever you spin ugliness, you spin beauty. And those are the pairs that populate the rectangle in that visual.
Right. Exactly. And in this diagram that I've got here on the screen, the two triangles, you can make a rectangle out of that. Just put a point up here between A and C and a point between D and B, and you've got a square, and a square is a rectangle. So,
but those squares and rectangles and those things are, you can never find a perfect square, perfect circle in the material world, right?
Right.
So they are in the realm of forms that means that they're immaterial.
Right.
They're eternal. Right. So that means the forms are transcendent beings, transcendent, metaphysical ideas, right? Pure ideas. And they have nothing to do with, they're not subject to change. They're not subject to the material world of change. And that's exactly, I think, what Plato is saying. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I agree with Jose that it is a question. It's a good question, and so in this dialogue with the Sophists, it brings into question, whether the forms can deny the process of change, and it puts into question whether the idea of forms has to accept the notion, the discussion about non-being. The Sophist is raising that question with their falsity, and that falsity implies a kind of the opposite of what being is, what the idea of the forms are. Can the forms, truthfully deny the idea of non-being, of nothingness, right? That which is present and eminent in the material world, or eminent in existence, right? Can something be outside of existence, or is it just a product of mental, rationality or reason?
It's a question, and I think maybe what you referred to as maybe what Eva was talking about earlier is this idea of creation of things that do not currently exist. And maybe that's kind of the irrational part of our existence. So there's rational existence, and then there's the incommensurable irrational, and that's where the creative part arises, I think. But maybe that's a thought that we can explore. So yeah, I the way I see Plato talking about the forms is that nothing exists beyond the forms. Like the forms define everything. So we'll go to Moshe.
Okay. I think I've discovered an equivocation here. First of all, let me just tease everyone with the idea that you had just said nothing exists beyond the forms, but we have, the forms are supposed to be being, okay, but nothing exists beyond the forms. But you said that we have to have the good in order for being to be known. So now you've got something that is not being, which is required in order for being to be known. And I find that problematic. I'm just going to throw that out there. I'm going to go back to your challenge. You challenge everyone to imagine something that comes into being without an opposite. Well, first I started thinking about a point. Okay, a point has an outside, but it doesn't have an inside. Okay, and then I started thinking about a circle. Well, a circle has no opposite. Okay, there's no such thing as a non-circle. If I ask you to bring me the non-circle in the room, you can't bring me anything. But then I noticed that you were flipping back and forth between something that we've talked about before, at least I know I've talked about it before, which is the distinction between a contradictory and a contrary. Okay. And contraries are those kinds of things that have opposites, usually hot and cold, soft and hard. I had the, I had the advantage the other day. There was a storm here in Rochester, and the trees are outside, and I usually take a tree to be fairly rigid. Okay, yeah, I go up to a tree and I press on it, and nothing happens. But I was looking at the wind blowing through those trees, and those things were just they were completely elastic. They were just completely flopping around. There was nothing rigid about them at all. And I've also given the example before of one contrary, and we can come up with lots of examples of these things. Of if I build a ladder from here to the moon, and I start climbing up the ladder, I'm going to be going up and up and up and up until I get to some point without changing direction. Now I'm going down and down and down, and I'm going to hit the moon with my head. All right, but I will be going down. So if we, I think Plato would be embarrassed if he thought that we were conflating, which means equivocating, on the notions of contraries or contradictories as opposites. And I think we should come down on one side or the other, because otherwise we're going to have to ask ourselves all the time when you're talking about an opposite, are you talking about a contrary like being and not being? Okay. Or are you talking about a contrary like up and down, hot and cold? And I just wonder how everybody else feels about that.
It's a fair question. I think that's something that we need to resolve, and we can look at the idea of not being in the first part of today's reading and consider whether that's whether the case that's being made there is right or wrong. In the point that you raised about knowing, it's really the part that I mentioned in my introduction about 248D to E, which is so in 240, it was 247E, where the visitor says, I'm saying that a thing really is, if it has any capacity at all, either by nature to do something to something else, or to have even the smallest thing done to it by even the most trivial thing, even if it only happens once. I'll take this as a definition of those which are amount to nothing other than capacity. So that's kind of the potential, so things that be have potential. And then he goes on to define knowledge, or at least put knowledge in that context at 248D, when he says, well, then, do you say that knowing and being known are cases of doing or having something done, or both? Is one of them doing and the other having something done, or is neither a case of either? And then Theaetetus responds, obviously, that neither is a case of either, since otherwise they'd be saying something contrary to what they said before. The visitor says, oh, I see. You mean that if knowing is doing something, then necessarily what is known has something done to it. When being is known by knowledge, according to this account, then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it, which we say wouldn't happen to something that's at rest. And so he's saying here, I think he's talking about the observer effect, where knowing isn't actually being, it's just knowledge of that which is. And that's the role of the mind, I think. So, being is everything around the mind, and the mind itself is necessarily separate. I mean, the mind is the observer, and being is that which is observed. And those have to be separate. You can't mix the two. You can't have the observer affecting the observed, because then you'd never have an accurate representation of the observed.
Well, then you have two beings.
Right.
You've got the mind and you've got this other thing.
Right.
And I don't think Plato was a dualist,
Right.
not in that way, not in the Cartesian sense.
Okay. Well, it's a fair point, and I think we need to arrive at some conclusion on that. So thank you for raising that. Darren, your thoughts?
So I had thoughts on the preceding discussion before your comments just now. So, but I also want to comment what you just said now. So that you brought up a really interesting section, And I think I might have interpreted it a little bit differently. I thought your reading was really interesting in that it ties in with like how the suggestion that like knowing something might like change it somehow. I thought it was actually a kind of refutation here of the idea that like being is a kind of capacity, because I thought there were like, I'll have to read this in more detail. Sorry, I'm just like looking at it now. There's like obviously a lot of like subtle argumentation here, but I thought he was saying that, you know, if the one, or if the being can be known, then then that somehow contradicts the idea that it's like a kind of that being is a kind of capacity, because it leads to these contradictions. So I thought this was just like part of the series where they were trying to define being as like being different things, and then like none of them seem to work. So, but an interesting implication of this part though is that like there's these interesting suggestions here that, you know, if that like being in the sense of like capital B being is like that it can't be known in a way, in this part you just read. So but I don't know.
That it requires reason, I think, is what is the point that was made in Timaeus 28a, is that being, that eternal realm, is not accessible to the physical senses, and so it requires the mind to apply reason to understand it.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So maybe there's different forms of apprehending things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Like there's a material, like he talks about the materialist at some point, where like their idea of knowledge is like running up to a tree and they're like grasping it really tightly, and they're this is knowledge.
Yeah.
But this like, so this 248e here, he says, when being is known by knowledge according to this account, then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it, which we say wouldn't happen to something that's at rest. So there's some like logical gymnastics here about like, if something is known, like, if being is known, then that creates problems. But we can look at that in a...
that's a mixture of change and rest, that whole argument there.
So there's a lot of this stuff in this dialogue, right? Like in the reading today, there's like this series of arguments where I thought what it was happening, what they were trying to refute various accounts of being, and like they seem to lead contradictions. So it's leading us somewhere, it seems. So I'll try. I want to comment on what the discussion preceding that, which was, so at first I wanted to just bring up a passage. Sorry, I have to like find it in the text again. Oh no, I lost it. Okay, I found it. Okay, it's at 253 to 253D to 2 and on from there. So they're like, so this is the section on like the nature of expertise, and the passage I wanted to start at like 253A basically. So this is where they start talking about expertise and how they've like gotten rid of like two notions. I'm just reading this from the top of the page. And they say there's only one option left, which is that some things. So they're okay. So the two options they supposedly discarded by this point is that like everything is like, or everything is not. Is that what they've discarded?
Right.
Yeah. And so at 252E,
right.
The visitor says, one of the following things has to be the case. Either everything is willing to blend, or nothing is, or some things are and some things are not. So it seems like they've settled on this third thesis that some things do mix with other things and some things don't. So there's sort of a pluralist view almost here now. And then they talk about letters of the alphabet and how like some letters go together to form words and some just like can't go together. And then the person's expert at grammar is can tell us, give an account of that. And then there's notes, like high notes versus low notes, and the musician is an expert at that and can give an account of that. And so there's different kinds of knowledge, it seems like, it turns out. And then so this leads me to what I want to read on 253D. I'll just read the section. So the visitor says, like, a person that can make such distinctions, he'll be capable of adequately, I'm quoting now, he'll be capable of adequately discriminating a single form spread out all through a lot of other things, each of which stands separate from the others. In addition, he can discriminate forms that are different from each other, but are included within a single form that's outside them, or a single form that's connected as a unit throughout many wholes, or many forms that are completely separate from others. That's what it is to know how to discriminate by kinds, how things can associate and how they can't. So the point I want to make is that I feel like this is just my reading of what's going on here in the Sophist. Like, I feel like we could talk about being in different registers. We can talk about being in a very abstract sense, like being with a capital B. And I think that's a possible discussion, and that's kind of discussion that Plato does have elsewhere. But there's a different question of being, which is just like simply being able to say what is or isn't. So I feel like this is a lower register discussion of being. We're not talking about like grand being with a capital B. We're just talking about what is or isn't. And this actually seems to follow from the previous discussion in the previous dialogue, the Theaetetus, about what knowledge is. And so at this lower register, I feel like the Plato's suggestion here is that that there are different things at work. It's not just one form. You know, we at this lower register of like knowing the world around us as human beings, it's not just like everything is one or everything is changed. Like that doesn't get us anywhere. I feel like he's suggesting, like, as I said, I feel like previously in the reading today, previous sections, he almost sounds impatient with like these endless battles, he calls it, between these opposite forces in philosophy, or opposite what do you call them, parties, or representatives of different views and schools in philosophy. And he's like coming out and saying, well, no, like the philosopher wants both, as he said at one point, and he wants to know like which things partake in these and how they partake in them and how they mix. And this is like, and the musician will have expertise in like musical notes, and the grammatist, the person who's expert in grammar, will have an expertise in how words can and can't go together and how the language works. And so it's like multifarious. And the philosopher, he's almost like trying to like shake us out of this like stupor of saying like everything is one or everything is changed, and being like, no, the philosopher wants to know the whole. He wants to know all of it, and how these opposites combine or not. So
that's I mean, you sort of skipped to the end there, but I think you raised a number of points that would get us to that point at the end. This idea of the forms blending. So we're not quite there yet, but it's an important point. And I think when you were talking about being in different registers, maybe that's the sense of the eternal being, which we can only access with our minds and reason, versus the realm of becoming that we see all around us, which is maybe, I think of that as the lower register. And that's from Timaeus 28a, that which always becomes, but never is, because it's always changing, right? So, and that's part of my proposition about the forms, is that the forms exist in that eternal realm of being, and that's how we understand this constantly changing realm of becoming. And so, but I think that's an important point. But you raise and how we get from this point to the end of today's reading, I think is very important. To make that distinction between the whole and the parts. And then how the forms actually operate with each other and associate with each other. So we'll come to that. And in the meantime, we'll go to Jose and then Eva. And then I think what I wanted to do was to move forward maybe to that part where they talk about the whole and the one. So we'll go to Jose and then Eva.
Yeah, this is a quick one. Related to what Darren was saying, I got the impression as well that there's a being with uppercase B and a being with lowercase b. And the reason for this goes as follows. You can take this one as an argument and then you can refute it. But when we, at least what I remember from those 3-minute videos that you find on being and all these definitions, being is, at least in philosophy and in ontology, being is the things that exist, right? And then he goes further to say, when you check, okay, what is existence? Well, existence is basically the ability of a thing to interact with their physical surroundings. All of a sudden, therefore, being is changing. So, because according to those two statements, of course, I mean, there could be some other context, but the simple argument says being is changing. So, if there's a being that is non-changing and eternal, there must be another being there. Maybe that's the one with the uppercase B and not with the lowercase b. That's all.
Yeah. And I think that's a good way actually of introducing that section from 244D to 245B that I've highlighted in the reading, that the being is what he's saying is the third thing that comes along. So we'll read that, I think, next, and I think that would be a good, what you just said, I think, is a good introduction to that part. So thank you. And then Eva.
Thank you. Yeah, Jose, thank you for that perspective. And I am kind of hearing Plato all of a sudden discussing about the being and the forms. I think I hear him letting us to question what we hear from people, because it's interesting. Why would he all of a sudden start talking about this at the time that all of a sudden there is this group of sophists around and he is talking about that? So I think maybe this is kind of like a brainstorming on the need to filter the ideas that we hear from sophists or any kinds of information filtering. So I think this leads to the spiral thinking, continuous thinking of like circles connecting to each other. And we might change our opinion on things in order to find our own thinking through filtering. Well, we have to hear everything that we can. And then we become to form our own circle, maybe. Or maybe I am just like really hearing what I want to hear from Plato. Yeah, thank you.
I like that idea of forming your own circle, and certainly the part in, dialogue and the process of dialectic, I think, is that, what allows us to understand or to apprehend the truth, or at least what we think is the truth of something that's important. And I think it's never more important than now, because of all of this power of technology, that we understand what is, and not accept the idea that which is not, which leads us into this, kind of infinite regression that Plato says the sophist gets caught in. So we have to deal with what is, and we have to try to understand the truth of what is. So I think and it's very important today. I think it's so important. It's what's causing all sorts of strife and discord among people, is this disagreement. And I think the more we talk about it, the more we come to some sort of common ground of understanding. So I wanted to move to this part. We'll run out of time, I think. But I think this is an important part. But I wanted to highlight in the themes that I've set out here, the first part of the dialogue, and this is from 235 to 241 or thereabouts. And these are just examples that I took of why the visitor is saying that that which is not is unthinkable. And I think Darren mentioned that near the beginning, that those words, and I think those words are. I'm just wondering if they're here on the screen. Yeah, no, I didn't put those particular words, but he says they're unthinkable, unutterable, and unsayable. And so I've just picked out some reasons or particular points to explain why they say that. So if you say something is not, well, what is not? And then you have to apply a name to it. So then all of a sudden you've given something, which is the name, you've said it's not. So applying a name to that which is not doesn't make sense. And then he talks again about numbers, so if you say that which is not, you're saying one thing is not, or those which are not, you're saying a multiple of things are not. But then again, how can you say one is not and the multiple is not? So I've just picked out some particular quotes there that I thought were effective in that argument in particular. So I'll let people read that on their own. So in this part, sort of from 242 to 242 through 245, the whole question is, how many beings are there? Is there multiple beings or is there one being? And I'll just highlight this part at the end of, it's around 240, it'd be around 244, where the visitor says, you understand exactly, Theaetetus. I'm saying we have to follow the track this way. Let's ask if they were here. He's talking about the people who says that there's multiple beings. Listen, you people who say that all things are just some two things, hot and cold, or some such pair. What are you saying about them both when you say that they both are and each one is? What shall we take this being to be? Is it a third thing alongside these two beings, so that according to you, everything is no longer two but three? Surely in calling one or the other of the two of them being, you aren't saying that they both are, since then in either case, they'd be one and not two. Well then, shouldn't we do our best to find out from the people who say that everything is one, what they mean by being? Well then, you call something being? Is that just what you call one, so that you use two names for the same thing, or what? So that's this, the potential confusion between you say that is, and then you say something else is. And so, do you have multiple of things being, or do you have just one thing being? And then he goes on in, I'll just read this part from 244D to 245B, where the visitor says, it's completely absurd and unacceptable for someone to say that there's a name if there's no account of it. If he supposes that a thing is different from its name, then surely he's mentioning two things. And moreover, if he supposes that the name is the same as the thing, he'll either be forced to say that the name is the name of nothing, or else, if he says that it's the name of something, then it's the name of nothing other than itself, and so will turn out to be only the name of a name and nothing else. And also the one, being the name of the one, will also be the one of the name. Well then, will they say that the whole is different from the one being, or the same as it? Theaetetus says, of course they'll say it's the same, and they do. And then the visitor quotes Parmenides. He says, but suppose a whole is, even as Parmenides says, quoting Parmenides, all round like the bulk of a well-formed sphere, equal balanced all ways from the middle, since neither anything more must it be this way or that way, nor anything less. So here Parmenides has said being can't be more or less than itself. Theaetetus says yes. Then the visitor goes on, but if a thing has parts, then nothing keeps it from having the characteristic of being one in all its parts. And in that way, it's all being, and it's also one whole. But something with that characteristic can't be just the one itself, can it? And Theaetetus says, why not? The visitor says, surely a thing that's truly one, properly speaking, has to be completely without parts. But a thing like what we've described, which consists of many parts, won't fit that account. Now, if that which is has the characteristics of the one in this way, will it be the one in a whole, or shall we simply deny that it's a whole at all? Theaetetus says it's a hard choice. The visitor concludes, you're right. If it has the characteristic of someone being one, it won't appear to be the same as the one. Moreover, everything will then be more than the one. Further, if that which is not a whole by possessing that as a characteristic, but rather just is the whole itself, that which is will turn out to be less than itself. And because it's deprived of itself, that which is will be not being, according to that account, and everything will be more than one. since that which is and the whole will each have its own separate nature. But if the whole is not at all, then the very same things are true of that which is. And in addition to not being, it would not even become a being. Invariably, whatever becomes has at some point become as a whole. So we can't label it being or becoming as being without taking the whole to be among the beings too. And moreover, something that isn't a whole can't be of any quantity at all, since something that's of a certain quantity has to be a whole of the quantity, whatever it may be. So this is a rather involved, convoluted argument, maybe, but it's here he's trying to tie the whole with the being of something. And the whole, if you, as I was reading this, I was thinking the whole really ultimately is the universe itself. And the universe itself consists of multiple things in being. And the question is, how do all of these multiple things that have being tie into this whole and constitute a unity? And so here he's saying that the whole consists of parts, and the parts together have the characteristic of one, but there are separate parts. So there are many parts, but they all tie together in one. And that's, I think, the power of the geometry in that quote from Parmenides, that we think of things like a sphere, and everything in the sphere has that balance point in the middle, so that the middle of the sphere is the unity of the sphere. And the sphere, everything inside is neither more nor less than the sphere itself. And that's what leads me really to think that there is some geometry in the forms. And certainly this particular quote from Parmenides resonates very well with 137e in the dialogue Parmenides. So there's a lot of consistency here. So I'm just wondering what people think about this idea of the whole and the parts of the whole that consist of individual being. Moshe.
Well, just to be true to the text, and it's true in my text too, which is the Joad translation. The visitor says, but suppose a whole is, as even Parmenides says, he says, all round like the bulk of a well-formed sphere. He is not talking about the sphere. He's talking about the whole. Okay, he's talking about everything he's talking about being as such, as the whole. Your language suggested to me that you were conflating the whole nature with a sphere, and I'm saying that's not what Parmenides was saying.
That's fair. I think the whole, in this context, he was talking about the whole of a thing. I was kind of extrapolating to the whole of the universe. So it was
it is the whole of the universe. I would prefer to use at this particular time in philosophical history to talk about the whole of nature, because the universe wasn't quite a concept at that particular time. Certainly not the way we think about the universe today. But you're right; he is talking about the whole of nature. Or he's talking about all of being.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Were you going to go on with the point, or was it the point was about what he was referring to in terms of the whole?
Yeah, it was about the part that he was referring to as a whole. Okay. I think that if part of what he's saying here, and part of what you were saying also, is that if something comes into being, it comes in as a whole. There are that to me is problematic. I mean, if you take a look at, does a pollywog not exist because it's not a whole frog yet? There are things that, is the worm not whole yet because it hasn't become a butterfly? I think that we have to be careful if we're going to apply that to things in the perceptual world. Although if you're talking about nature, certainly nature would not be growing, clearly not on a Parmenidean level, because to him there was no motion. Everything, it was static, and it was complete. In order to be able to have motion, you'd have to have some place for being to move into that it wasn't there, and that's impossible.
I understand, yes. And I think, the whole would refer to, I'm seeing it as referring to more general categories. It's not necessarily that the physical thing has formed a whole, the butterfly example. It's that the thing, which is the animal that, becomes the butterfly in the physical world, that thing itself is defined as a whole. Right? That's the way I see it. Although it clearly in the physical world, it changes throughout time, as do any of us change throughout time. So maybe it's a distinction between the physical and the non-physical. But it's an important point to raise. So I think that's an important point to understand. So thank you. We'll go to JK and then Eva.
So you just made a distinction between the idea of the whole and the reality of the physical world, having its separate individual movements and existence, right, and being. So if the whole is really what is the truth of existence, then the individual material existence of parts are just illusions, right? There is no individual. The parts are there, but they're just part of the whole, and so they have no separate individual existence on their own, and therefore all movement, all activity is canceled because they are just part of the whole. Right.
Yeah, I would. It's an interesting thought. I would say, certainly the individual parts manifest themselves in thought, manifest themselves in the state of coming to be in the physical world.
Sure.
But I think the interesting thing I found here is when he says the characteristic of being one, this part. But if a thing has parts, then nothing keeps it from having the characteristic of being one. And so it's all being and it's all one whole.
Yeah.
And I think that's the interesting idea that I found, the characteristic of being one. And maybe this is something that will help us with the dialogue Parmenides.
Right. So is Plato's forms a kind of something like a reconciliation or a middle ground between this Parmenides idea of the whole, of being and the Sophists' refutation of that, with their falsity and idea of non-being. So it seems like the forms are kind of like coming down on, well, let's reconcile this. We accept that there are individual parts in the realm of becoming, but they are just copies of. They're not real. I mean, they're just copies of the forms, and the forms represent the whole, right?
Yeah.
So it's an acknowledgement that there is some something to the what's occurring in the realm of becoming, right? But they are just copies of the forms.
Right, that moving image of eternity that was in Timaeus 37 that I mentioned earlier. This you can't have eternity itself in the state of becoming. So you have to have this image or this copy in the state of becoming. And this is what I found so powerful about this quote from Parmenides, this idea of the bulk of a well-formed sphere, equal balanced always from the middle. This point in the middle, maybe that reconciliation that you were talking about, the point where all of the logic comes down to this one single point in the middle of that sphere. And from the middle of that sphere, you can go out to the extremities of the sphere, and you've still got the whole, but you have access to all of the parts. And that's where I think the forms are that kind of mental model that we use to understand all of this, but always having that single point of unity in the logic. That's the way I see it, and I found that sphere analogy to be very helpful, and that's why I put those 3 diagrams that we were talking about earlier. And I said, imagine them inside a circle, and how they would operate inside that circle. That very point in the middle that I had labeled E, I thought was kind of the important point, and that's where the part today that we're reading, I think, ends with talking about harmonics, and how do you get the parts to harmonize with the whole.
Yes, also is Parmenides' idea of the whole, and this whole is what really exists, and there's nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
Is that derived from the idea that man is the measure of all things?
Yeah, the idea of man that is a measure of all things was discussed in the dialogue Theaetetus, and I think what was being held there by Protagoras is that man has a capacity to determine that which is in fact is, and that which is not is in fact not. And I think that was refuted in the dialogue, because we can't have, and I think we know now that we can't have perfect knowledge of physics because of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle.
Sure.
And then that realm of being is accessible only by reason, and nobody's reasoning is perfect. So I would see those as 2 refutations of that idea that man is the measure of all things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it sounds to me like Parmenides arrives at this understanding of the whole by virtue of reason, right?
Right.
And
right.
And then by virtue of reason is man's reason. Man's reason,
mm-hmm.
which is man being the measure of all things.
Right. Right. But I think in here he's using geometry, and I think that may be a key to understanding, because geometry, there is no uncertainty in geometry, except when you get into the incommensurables. And the interesting thing about the 5 Platonic solids that he deals with, or that's dealt with in Timaeus, is that they contain both rational and irrational parts, and transcendental parts. And if you understand that geometry, I think the geometry can be used to prove a point. So,
mm-hmm. Right.
That's where.
But then, of course, what is Guido's, assertion?
Right.
Of that, I think he's sort of refutes that, right? That
the incompleteness theorem. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that maybe goes to what Eva was saying earlier, in that the incompleteness of things means that we always have the potential or the capacity to expand reality. So that may be a good example of putting Gödel's incompleteness theorems into application. So, we'll go to Eva, then Darren.
Thank you. So if we are seeing the presence as the butterfly being of the form, then there is only one presence in one form, and I think that's super limiting. A butterfly has a lot of form, and being the butterfly is only one of them. But if I see, if I define being as a journey, then each journey starts from a point, and each journey leads to a point. And each journey has to go to somewhere. I kind of want to connect that being and becoming both to the center and the destination. So seeing the destination and the starting point of the journey, what if it's connected to the center of the sphere? So a butterfly cycles and it just goes back again. The metamorphosis happens with a cycle, and once there's no ending. So it makes sense to me that if there's a journey and if there's a destination to that journey, there has to be a starting point. And I am wondering if this questioning will be easier if we try to connect that center of the sphere to the whole being, or maybe a second of the presence of any being. So I think this was the easiest way to describe for me in this time.
Yeah, I think you raised a point here which may be discussed at around 250, well, from 258 to D, and the idea of change and rest being opposites. So the question is, how can you have change and how can you have rest? And, this maybe kind of journey between change and rest that you were referring to, that's the way I'm understanding it. And just because I didn't put it in the reading, and it's important to understand in this context of the harmonics, which we'll end with shortly. But I wanted to highlight so they were dealing with the fact that change and rest exist. They both exist, but they're contrary to each other. In fact, that's what he says at 250A. So Visitor says, now then, wouldn't you say that change and rest are completely contrary to each other? Theotetus says, of course. The Visitor says, and you'd say that they both equally are, and that each of them equally is. Yes, says Theotetus. And the Visitor says, when you admit that they are you saying that both and each of them change? Not at all. And are you signifying that they rest when you say that they both are? Of course not. So do you conceive, the Visitor says, that which is as a third thing alongside them, which encompasses rest and change? And when you say that they both are you taking the two of them together and focusing on their association with being? And I think that's very key. So the point here is that the point of being, the single point of being, can take that journey whichever way we want it. And so in this drawing, to go back to my drawing, that third thing, which the Visitor is referring to, that very single point of being, which has the capacity of both change and rest, has to necessarily be in the middle of both change and rest, and therefore neither change and rest, so that it can be either. And in this particular drawing with the two triangles, this is the cross where I joined the vertical, the top of the vertical line with the right of the horizontal, and I joined the bottom of the vertical line with the left of the horizontal. So it forms two right angled triangles. The point in the very middle, if you put this in a circle and you rotate it, it's all going to rotate together. The opposites are those two triangles. And that third point is the very middle point, which can be either. It's neither of the two opposites, but it's either. And so that's the third point. And I think that's the power of this presentation of being, is that it's either of those two, but it requires, what the Visitor is saying is this harmony at the whole and its association. So being associates with the opposites, but it is not the opposites. It associates with them. So if I understand the point, that's how I saw the journey that you were describing. So thank you for that. And Darren, your thoughts?
Just think about what you just said now. So it seems like then that being exists as well as rest and change, because being can't be rest and change, or else it leads us to problems. So is that what I hear you?
Right.
Or okay, where we're going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's just sometimes I just need like a concluding statement.
Because it would contradict. It would contradict. If being were change, then you wouldn't have rest, and if being were rest, then you wouldn't have change, right?
And so I hear in this, like a kind of refutation of the idea that the people who say that everything is change or everything is resting, because there has to be this thing being, like it can't just be those things, because being has to be there.
Right.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I raised my hand because I wanted to talk about the passage that really long passage you just read. So I'm trying to go back to it. Where was that? Was it? That was
250A to 250A to B.
250? Really?
Yeah, 250.
Okay.
Yeah, just before this part on harmonics.
third thing. No, sorry. The long passage you were reading before that.
Oh,
we were discussing before.
Yeah, this one.
The wholeness.
Yeah,
the
244 to 245. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Let me bring that.
Yeah.
I had like
right here on the screen.
Yeah. 44. Okay, yeah, the part about Parmenides and that. So I just want to like see if my understanding is like the same as what everybody else is that's going on here, about what's going on here. So I understood him as saying that. So at the very end of what you read, I'm just going to read that one line beyond that. So this is at 245E, right there. So the visitor concludes, and millions of other issues will also arise, each generating indefinitely many confusions if you say that being is only two or one. And then they go on from there to tackle a different view, which is that being is like, the materialist versus the rationalist from here. So, but okay, so this section above is about. So it seems like what he's done. I just want to share my understanding with others, so make sure I'm on the same page as everyone else. Like I see him as taking Parmenides' thesis and saying that if like what Parmenides says about the sphere is right, or if we just take that as a premise, then it contradicts the idea that being is either two or one, or that being is one. But I think prior to this, they've refuted the other idea. So is the conclusion then that we should accept some of the things that Parmenides said, such as maybe about wholeness? But if we take those things, if we take that to be true, then being can't just be one, like, or two. I'm just checking my understanding, because that's sort of what I feel like. That's sort of what I understand is going on in this long stretch, and then it goes on to various other stretches. Like this stretch is saying that there's something like, okay, if we take this idea of wholeness, if we accept those things that are being said, then it's going to lead to problems with the thesis that these various schools make, that being is either one or two. That both those theses are kind of like problematic. That like we can have being and we can have whole, but like then everything can't just be one, like as Parmenides would also like to insist. So he's sort of pointing out, he's sort of like taking something from Parmenides, but also just like leaving off like taking off from Parmenides as well. So that's sort of what I see is going on. I just don't know. I just want to like wrap. I just don't know if other people are sharing this.
Yeah. It's a good point to raise, and I think he's very much supporting Parmenides here. And it was Parmenides who gave that analogy of the sphere. Right. And the sphere has that middle, and the middle is the one single thing. But I think the key words here are this characteristic of being one. Well, it's still a whole, so it's both one and a whole. But it's because the whole is a sphere that all of the parts are contained in the sphere. So the parts can manifest themselves, but they have the characteristic of being one because they're all contained by the sphere. They can't go outside the limits of that sphere. So that's what makes them have the characteristic of being one. But they aren't, clearly there are parts, but so it's not just like there's one single part or one single thing. Like there's multiple parts, but they're all tied together. They all form that single logic. So they have that characteristic of being one. That's the way I'm understanding it. So there's still a whole in that they're all contained in that sphere. Okay. And there's only the one sphere. Yeah. Okay.
So maybe the thing that's being refuted is that being is one.
Right.
Is that okay? Because I feel like something's being refuted here, because they're saying that it leads to all these complexities, and there's like they've generated some kind of problem, and then they move on to a different problem. Yeah. So okay, I'm just trying to understand. I guess I'm trying to understand what's being refuted, and maybe the thesis is that being is either being is one or being is two, and okay.
Yeah, they're saying it has to be being. It has to be a whole, and it has to be one, and this is the way you can have it both as the whole and one. And I think this characteristic word is the key thing to understanding that what they're saying there. It has a character. It operates as one, but it is not one. It's a whole. Thanks. Yeah. So, Moshe, your thoughts?
Okay. I just want to go back to the Parmenides quote. He's talking about being, or the whole, as he calls it, and he's saying it is like a sphere. Okay, it is not a sphere itself. Now, whether it's one or two, from a Parmenidean standpoint, it could not possibly be two, because if it was two, there would have to be something which is non-being that separates one from the other. And just like there cannot be anything outside the whole, because if there was something outside the whole, that which would be outside being would be non-being. And likewise, there cannot be motion, because in order for there to be motion, there has to be something through which being moves, and that would have to be non-being. Being can't move through being. So it has to be, and eternity goes the same way. There is no non-being. There is no it is completely filled, and it is eternal in the sense that it's static. There's no time outside of it. So this idea of the whole, people keep talking about it being a sphere. It's not. It's just like the sphere, that it's solid. There's not something else outside of it. There aren't two of them, and things like that. And we're speaking here on the highest level of abstraction. We're not talking about pollywogs and butterflies and things like that. Remember that Parmenides denied all those things and said, if you're talking about the way of truth, none of that stuff exists. On the other hand, if you're talking about the way of opinion, we do have pollywogs and frogs and things like that. And Plato maintains that same distinction, because he says that what we can have knowledge of is knowledge of being, which is going to be eternal, good, beautiful, infinite, all that good stuff. But the stuff that moves and changes, we can only have opinion about that, because the mind can never latch onto any of those things. So he's accepting the Parmenidean distinction between knowledge or truth and opinion, just like Parmenides did. And the only on both of them, the only idea that there's any motion or change at all is at the level of illusion, in the strongest terms.
Yeah. And I think as you said at the beginning, I see the sphere as an analogy, and he says like the bulk of the well-formed sphere. So I agree with you. I don't think he's saying that it is a sphere, but it's like it. So if I gave that impression, I take it back. I think it isn't. The sphere is the analogy. But, if that mental kind of image is helpful, as Jose kind of used that mental imagery earlier, I think it helps to think of it that way. And, if I were drawing it, I would draw it that way. So that's something that we can certainly keep in mind, but yet not literally necessarily. So thank you for that. I just, in the time that's left, maybe we have just about 10 minutes left, unfortunately, but it's always the way. We can always come back to this, because the ending part of the Sophist, we've got less reading to do for that for 2 weeks from now. So I think we have to revisit some of these thoughts and bring it all together, because I think it'd be really good if we can come to some sort of consensus on the forms. And I think this particular part at the end that I wanted to highlight, 252b to 253c, is the association of the form. So if the being, is that part that I read from 250a to b, so a while ago, if we accept that being is a third thing, so that we've got two opposites and being is right in the middle of the opposites, it's cutting the opposites in two. So it's neither opposite, but it's in between. So it could be anything, but it's sitting there right in between. And that gives it great power, right? So it's the proposition is that being is the third thing that is between everything, that reconciles it. I think was somebody used the word earlier. And that all came about from that discussion of how can change and rest exist at the same time, because they contradict each other. So that's how they concluded that change and rest can exist at the same time by making being the third thing that comes between them. So this part here at the end, I think is important, because that's where the knowledge of the philosopher comes in reconciling or tying all of this together. So, and it's also very important to understand the nature of the form. So the form isn't just the one single thing. So he's saying that the form, that for each thing that exists, and there's potentially infinite numbers of things that exist, either that exist now or that we could create out of our thoughts. He's saying you can't have one single form for each individual thing. It just wouldn't work. So he's saying here the forms have to associate with each other. And so maybe I'll just read this part here. The visitor says, starting at 252b, but furthermore, the most ridiculous account is the one that's adopted by the people who won't allow anything to be called by a name that it gets by association with something else. They're forced to use being about everything, and also separate from others of itself, and a million other things. They're powerless to keep from doing it. That is, from linking them together in their speech. So they don't need other people to refute them, but have an enemy within, as people say, to contradict them. And they go carrying him around and taking in an undertone inside them, like the strange ventriloquist Eurycles. Well then, what if we admit that everything has the capacity to associate with everything else? And there's that word again, capacity, which he's concluded being has capacity. Theocritus says, I can solve that one, because if change and rest belong to each other, then change would be completely at rest, and conversely, rest itself would be changing. Visitor says, but I suppose it's ruled out by very strict necessity that change should be at rest and that rest should change. So the third option is the only left. Certainly one of the following things has to be the case. Either everything is willing to blend, or nothing is, or some things are and some things are not. And we found that the first two options were impossible. So everyone who wants to give the right answer will choose the third, since some will blend and some won't. They'll be a good deal like letters of the alphabet. Some of them fit together with each other and some don't. Well then, we've agreed that kinds mixed with each other in the same way. So if someone's going to show us correctly which kinds harmonize with which and which kinds exclude each other, doesn't he have to have some kind of knowledge as he proceeds through the discussion? And in addition, doesn't he have to know whether there are any kinds that run through all of them and link them together to make them capable of blending? And also, when there are divisions, whether certain kinds running through holes are always the cause of the division. And then he goes on to say that it takes expertise and dialectic to figure this out, so this knowledge of harmony, as I said in the introduction, I think that would necessarily require knowledge of number and calculation, and certainly understanding of proportion. And so I think this is when I reread this made me really think deeply about the nature of the forms. And I had previously thought that the forms were just one single form for each individual thing, whether it's something trivial like hair or mud, I think was the example that was used in earlier, whether I think it was Phaedo or the first part of the Sophist, I can't remember. But this is saying, no, you don't need a separate form for things like hair and mud necessarily. They can be combinations of other forms. There could be other forms that divide things to generate hair and mud. But it's the fact that things are able to associate with each other, and they can associate with each other because being comes in the middle of everything. And I found that particularly just a powerful image about the forms, and it really made me think very differently, I think, about them. So I wonder what your thoughts are. Moshe?
Well, this particular section is rife with equivocations on being, because he's talking about beings like things that we find around us in the world, things that we can perceive and touch. And then he's going and immediately talking about being, which is those things that actually exist. Because the things in the world, to go back to one of your favorite things, James, are things that are becoming but never be, they never exist, but they're always becoming. So it's really inappropriate to compare the the characteristics of a world of becoming with the actual with being itself. Because I mean, we have a tendency to anthropomorphize that because we're human thinkers. But if you think about it seriously, we can't possibly know how these things would be an adequate comparison. And your idea about hair and mud, I want to point out that everything that he says in the world that participates, and this comes out later in the dialogue, it participates in a particular form, participates in a lot of forms at the same time. Okay, so there would be no participation of hair, but there would be a participation of there would not be an idea of hair, but there would be an idea of softness and extension and sheen and color, specific colors, brown, red, and so on, that this particular object of becoming participates in. But like the stranger says later in the dialogue, for any particular thing that we're looking at in the world that has all its forms that it participates in an infinite number of things that it is not. Okay, because if the hair is soft, it's not scraggly, and if it has a sheen, it's not all flat colored, and if it's long, it's not it's not short. So I think we have to be careful about these equivocations and the comparisons between stuff in the world and stuff that we consider to be true objects of knowledge, which are the forms. And we also have to be clear about the nature of what it is to for something in the world to participate in multiple forms at the same time. I mean, this is when you're in the weeds here, this is tricky stuff. I admit that.
Sure, it is definitely deep in the weeds. And I don't see in the section that I just read from 252b to 253b or so, I don't see any necessity of tying it to the realm of becoming. I think it applies to both the realm of becoming and the eternal realm of being. So I think I used the hair and mud example just because it was something that had come up earlier, but I think it applies to all forms of being. Or all forms of existence, I should say. So including the realm of becoming. So, but not necessarily just exclusively the realm of becoming. So, but it's a good distinction to make. So we'll go to JK, and I think unfortunately we are out of time today. But as I said, we can certainly pick up on these and other themes as we wrap up the Sophist next time. So JK, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess it comes down to whether you, agree with the argument that there is this intelligence in the world of becoming, right? And the becoming is just not just a chaos of random, entities, without any purpose or meaning, So, there is. In the world of becoming, in nature, there's always, beings coming into existence with instinctive, at least instinctive, that gives them some sense of order, to survive, to be able to interact with with everything else in the environment to survive. And some beings are also inherent, come into the world inherent with intelligence, and where does that intelligence come from? Do we just learn it from, is intelligence just acquired, and how do we acquire that intelligence if we didn't have some form of capacity, right? Some form of capacity to acquire it. So there is a kind of intelligence that's inherent. And it's just, and that seems like that kind of, the notion that there's this, argument for being, right, the wholeness, is kind of arguing for that, that there's an inherent intelligence, that we're not just we don't just come into the world with an empty slate. Our minds are not just empty slates, or our beings are not just empty slates that, but even if it was, right, there is something there that endows the beings with a sense of intelligence, whether it's in form of instinct or rationality.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Actually, I knew it was in this reading today, and I just found it. It's at 248a. So he says here, but for heaven's sake, are we going to be convinced that it's true that change, life, soul, and intelligence are not present in that which wholly is, and that it neither lives nor thinks, but stays changeless, solemn, and holy without any understanding? Here he's talking about the universe. Or at least that's the way I read it. And so he's saying that intelligence exists in the universe itself. And so I think what you just said it seemed to me a very interesting way of connecting this, like, where does intelligence come from? It just doesn't appear out of thin air. It's there to start off with. The universe itself is intelligent. That's the way I read that particular, those few lines from 249. And I think to me, it seems logical. I mean, if we are part of the whole, we are intelligent to some degree, and the whole has to have intelligence as well. And what is intelligence? Well, maybe it's understanding differences, and understanding differences is understanding harmony, and maybe that's what it's all about. I mean, that's kind of how I'm reading the logic of this whole section today. So I think that was a very good point to raise, and I think that's one that we can continue to discuss next time as well. So, as I said, unfortunately, we are out of time for today, but I wanted to thank everybody. I mean, what a fantastic discussion on some very intricate points. And let's keep it going for the next time. And I think what we've got, I want to take a summer break by the end of June. So I think that would leave us with 7 sessions remaining. And it was suggested that we do statesman next. So I think I like that suggestion, because that kind of logically follows this dialogue. So next session, we'll finish the Sophist, and then we'll move to statesman, and then we'll end season 2 of Plato's Pod with Parmenides. And I think, having done the Sophist and the statesman, I think we will be well positioned to understand the dialogue Parmenides, which is very complicated and very intricate. So that's what I'm thinking. So again, looking forward to continuing the discussion in 2 weeks. And thank you, everybody, for participating today. It's fascinating, as always, and to hear different perspectives, and to put some new knowledge, or to form some new knowledge where perhaps there wasn't before. So always good. And so I'll end the recording now, but those who want to stay online for Plato's Cafe, just casual, unrecorded half-hour discussion, please do stay on, and we'll have that chat. And otherwise, we'll see each other hopefully in 2 weeks. So thank you again, everybody.